Hello, everybody. I am Scott Mead. I'm a senior architect with OpenSCG, and I'm here today to talk about Chef and Puppet and provisioning and all those great things. Essentially, this all boils down to configuration management and Postgres. So Postgres is kind of unique. It's a database. It seems like any other service, so how can we apply configuration management patterns in a way that makes sense, in a way that's safe, and is useful? Again, I'm Scott Mead, Senior Architect with OpenSCG and BigSQL. BigSQL is we call it the world's most complete and developer-friendly distribution of the world's most advanced open source database. Say that 5 times fast. OpenSCG is the open source consulting group. We started back in 2009 providing services and support, not just around Postgres, but other open source tools as well. These are usually a lot of fun, not just for me, but for you too, because I can't stand still, and I'm up on a raised platform today, so hey, we'll see what happens. Usually, I end up taking a fall. I've already been warned I have to stay right here just because there's a camera recording. We'll see how it goes. So when we talk about configuration management, when we talk about Chef, Ansible, Puppet, Bob's Backyard Provisioning System, whatever it happens to be, one of the big terms that is kind of looming in that area is DevOps. And I love the agility that this terminology gives us, but I kind of don't like it because it feels like it's hiding a lot of things. So what is DevOps? Is it development and an ops team? Is it developers that are operations, or is it operations staff that are developers? The reality is you got to be careful, because it doesn't mean that developers, well, some people think that it means developers should be responsible for production. I've been a developer before, and that lifestyle doesn't lead itself well to being responsible for anything, let alone production systems. It's also easy to say that ops people should be responsible for the code. So I think a DBA is kind of the epitome of DevOps in general, because you kind of have to walk both of those lines. You are writing code, whether you're writing shell scripts that do deployment or whether you're writing stored procedures, but you're also worried at 2 a.m., why is it that I have 75 idle in transactions and everything's backed up on this one exclusive lock? It's kind of a weird world. Other than DBAs, the two skill sets, they really don't intersect a whole lot. You know, there's always that diamond in a rough. There's a developer, I know a few of them, who can deploy with a quick keystroke to 17 production servers, and away it goes. But they really don't like to be woken up at weird hours. So if we step back for a second and say, what in the world is DevOps? It really boils down to a couple of things. One of them is developing operational infrastructure in code. So it is taking those few, high-speed sysadmins that are scripters and writing code. Now, when it comes to writing code, especially when you're talking about deploying things, whether I'm dealing with Windows, oops, I said Windows, or Ubuntu, or CentOS, or Red Hat, or Oracle Enterprise Linux. I think that's worse than saying Windows. But you're usually dealing with all of those, and what about Solaris, and what about AIX, which are reality. The problem is that we spend more time writing scripts that define how to get us from A to B, not what I want to happen. So our sysadmins don't spend time being systems administrators. They're developing an entire code base around how to deploy stuff to a specific system. And if you're on the other side, if you are a developer, you want to be able to rapidly deploy an application. This is especially true for Java people, even more than some of the newer stacks that you'll find in Python. But I have to be able to very quickly make those deployments, make them happen to a wide range of servers, validate that they're good, and then move on with my life. So DevOps is kind of both of those, and it can be a challenge. Now, when you're talking about provisioning, or when you're talking about infrastructure, a lot of times I need a new node, right? So, okay, app, We've been deployed with app host 01, app 02, and app 03 for 6 months. They're great, they're beautiful, they're working. But I need a new one, right? So what's involved with that? Think about the steps that are involved, whether you're a systems administrator or just somebody that's stuck waiting on the ticket to get completed by the systems administrators. What actually has to happen, right? Once the actual thing is available, whether it's a virtual machine running CentOS or it's a physical piece of hardware, now I've got to deal with the host name. I've got to deal with IPs. I've got to do authentication, any updates. What standard packages does my company require? How about monitoring? What are the standard mount points, the security policies? Yada, 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 yada. In the dark days when I was when I was an intern doing this kind of stuff, I was really bad at my job, but it would take half a day. And I mean, the reality is just downloading updates, and then back before we had things like Yum, it would take you half a day to figure out what order to get RPMs installed in. But all of these things take time, especially when you're talking about, it sounds simple, but what about authentication and security policies? If I'm hooking this thing up to some single logon, or whether I'm integrated with Active Directory, now I've got to get the Windows admin, or I have to go log into my Windows admin and make sure blah, 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 blah. It's just a nightmare. And then, oh, by the way, that's CentOS 7 too, which completely changed how you authenticate against Active Directory. So all of these things are very error prone, and especially when you're doing it, if you have a run book to kind of do it, it barely works. And if you have a shell script, you have to make sure that every step has completed exactly as it was supposed to. And so you can't just run a script. You actually have to run each section of the script and then validate before you can move on to the next one. So it can be very challenging just getting a new node with the basics on it so that you can hand it over to developers or to the guys that are going to deploy the stack. All right, so now that we've got our, let's be optimistic and say it's half a day. We have to set up the stack. So we want Postgres on there, or we want our application. We've got a bunch of dependencies that we have to install. Then Postgres, maybe Python, Perl. Fix the fact that the Postgres home dir is a wacky thing when you use the default packages. What about our backup script? SSH keys, the backup jobs. We got to set up the firewall, all those extra things. It's just a lot of steps we have to go through. And again, shell scripts are very error prone unless you have somebody whose job it is to maintain development, to basically maintain those deployment scripts at all times, right? So you're really looking to get a new app server or a new DB server. It's a few days. Now, I've seen companies where they'll beat this when they're doing it kind of this way by a few hours. I've literally seen this take 6 to 8 weeks to get to this point before. Those are companies that, they can't scratch their own back, but whatever, it is what it is. So you all say, okay, now let's just step back for a second, because does anybody actually do any of that manually anymore? Some people still do, and some people find that it's the best way to go. Others say, okay, I've got to do it 5 more times. I've got to set up the replicas. Now I need a QA version, dev, regression. How do I manage all that? I could very simply script it, right? All right, so when I script it, at the very beginning of my code, I have to check, am I on Ubuntu? Am I on Red Hat variant? What flags can I send to Yum? What flags can I send to apt-get? I don't know. Have you ever tried to figure out what version of Linux you're on? So if you cat etc release and you look at the very first line of it, the format is completely different from platform to platform. And by the way, I'm saying etc star release, maybe it's etc CentOS release, maybe it's etc Red Hat release, who knows what that file actually is. This thing is just returning the first line of maybe 10 files, and I'm hoping that the glob here works out the way I'm expecting it to. So already this code is completely broken, right, for trying to just determine, can I run, which version of the operating system tools can I run? Similarly, once you figure out what tools you can use, now you've got to deal with package names. So, I see some of you have laptops, a lot are Macs, but if somebody has an Ubuntu, find a neighbor that has a CentOS, and go ahead, install OpenSSL libs. Go ahead, do it right now. See how long it takes. You've got to search, is it currently OpenSSL devel? Is it libssl dev? Or is it libssl 098-dev- whatever? Who knows, right? It's a pain in the neck. And figuring out all that out, this is just simple package installation, and already you see where we're going, right? There's another problem with all that, with writing shell scripts. This is a big, nasty, it's a big word, and I'm not really good with big words, so we're going to argue on the pronunciation. But you know, is a step in a script idempotent? Basically, what I want to make sure is that no matter what the inputs are, the outputs are the same. So if my job is to always install a Postgres user on a machine, how can I do that consistently? Can I do it with a simple echo? Right now I've got a capital, this will fail because auto capitalization worked for me, but can I just echo the Etsy password line to the end of it? Maybe. But this right here is raw. What if a user ID of 26 already exists? I just, you know, create a logical problem in my Etsy password file. What if that user already exists and I've duplicated the user? The whole problem here is I don't know what the beginning state is, so by just modifying the file, I'm getting an unknown output state. So when I say idempotent, I mean that no matter what, when I'm done, I should have a Postgres user and it should have this ID, but we have to validate the input step, the input as well. That is not straightforward to do. You've got to add some greps, you've got to do some other things, and then what happens if you find there's that else case that you can't deal with or you can't foresee in code? You know, else printf, somebody come fix this manually, right? You're breaking down. So scripting can go so far, but you got to be careful with it. So, all right, so now I'm complaining about configuration files. I've been doing that all week. Configuration files are a pain in the neck. And so how do we deal with it? How do we deal with idempotency? How do we deal with the fact that things are in a different state? And how do we deal with very quickly getting a machine into a state that we want it to? Well, I have a couple of tools I'm going to use here. And we'll talk about them. Right now, I'm going to be using Virtualbox, which many of you may have heard of. It's a hypervisor. You probably have heard of something called VMware as well. Kind of works the same way. I also have a tool called Vagrant. Vagrant, I don't work for HashiCorp. If you've heard of them, they're a great company. I like some of their tools. Vagrant is a very, very cool, simple way to manage virtual machine templates. I wouldn't use it in production. As a matter of fact, the HashiCorp guy that's here nods crazily when I say you should not use it in production. But the idea is that there are tools available. Vagrant's one. You look at Salt or Terraform or any number of tools. Essentially, their job is to take a template of a machine that's been built and help you along the way. So that first half of a day, how would you get that out of the way? And then enter Puppet and Chef. Puppet and Chef are really designed to enforce the state that I have told them to. They are going to get us from whatever unknown state we're in to that deterministic state that I want to be in. That's their goal, all right? So you think about it a little bit. If we were using something like Chef, what would we actually do in real life? I would have a Git repository or some kind of repository that was managing all of my Chef cookbooks. In Puppet, they're called manifests. And periodically, the Chef server or the Puppet server would say, hey, give me the latest version. And then the clients running on every machine would contact that server and get the updated version and push our code out for us. So it sounds beautiful if I say, hey, you know what, I need to add a user to the entire database farm. We just got a new DBA, and I got to push that new user out. I could make a commit to Git, and then within 30 minutes, poof, the user appears everywhere, right? It does work. It works well. There are some challenges to it, but we'll talk about them. The other thing I realize is that I started and I didn't say this. If you guys have questions, please feel free to stop me, except for Bruce. Yeah, Bruce.
So if you're going to use Chef or Puppet, I assume you probably sort of set up the environment manually on a machine to figure out what you actually want it to look like before you start using those tools. Is that right?
That's a good question. So the question, just for the video, is if we were using Chef or Puppet, would you essentially build that environment manually and then move ahead with it? And I'll actually show you the workflow for that. It's not quite manual. Some steps are. Sometimes you have to manually hack on things and figure them out, but I'll show you kind of the workflow for that and developing that. And that's actually where the tool set that I'm going to show you in just a minute with Vagrant and Virtualbox helps you through that, because there is a lot of iterative development to that, especially when you get to things like, how do I make Active Directory deploy cleanly on multiple types of Linux? So give me a few minutes, Bruce, and if I don't answer your question effectively, hold me to it. Okay, so I showed you this picture. Oops. I showed you this picture, which is what we would kind of do in real life. What are we going to do here? So here I have everything running inside little Mr. Mac. And I don't have a Git repository involved. I just have some local files. That is my Chef cookbooks. And I am using Chef. So we said we can do Puppet and Chef. I'll show you a couple of syntax things, but the demos that I've done are in Chef, just because I like it better. All right, everybody knows what VirtualBox and VMware do for the most part, but just so we're on a level set, it's a virtual machine, right? Vagrant is essentially going to take an image, a virtual image for me, and deploy it inside of that hypervisor. So, you know, some people say, okay, well, you're adding all these tools. Why is it that that's any better than just a virtual machine snapshot? I can go in, I can build my VM in VMware, get it just the way I want it with the updates I want, and then take a snapshot of it. I think it's easier, and I'll show you why. There's a lot less work to do, and I'm a lazy sysadmin, so I'm all about less work. Less convoluted than clones. When you start cloning things, it's very easy to start taking linked clones, and then you end up with all these crazy links in the system, and you can't copy them because of other problems, and you got to deal with resetting the MAC address, and there's all kinds of problems with it. And it is easier than manually copying VMs. It takes a lot less time. So let's just look. What is involved with copying a VM, right? We're not going to walk through all of this, but this is my workflow. I start the copy, and then, oops, I'm out of disk space. Okay, so I make disk space. Then I copy it, I start the machine, and then VMware asks me, did you move it or did I copy it? I always pick the wrong one, the MAC address gets screwed up, and then it can't see anything on the network, and my laptop won't work. So I restart the machine, then the network interface is gone. There's a huge consistent workflow that many of you have probably dealt with here, involving, you know, when I was getting ready for this, I had to do this, is how do I CentOS remove eth0 command line? So you find your Stack Overflow answer, you apply it, and blah, 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 right? So even, you know, when you go to asking your sysadmin to get a new machine for you, or if you're just in a development environment trying to deploy a snapshot that you yourself have built, it's a pain in the neck, and it takes a lot of time, okay? So let's do it with Vagrant. So with Vagrant, essentially you have to download and install a Vagrant tool. It's a free tool. You have to download and install a hypervisor and the Virtualbox connector between Vagrant and Virtualbox. That is free and all included. So, and Virtualbox, you know, just I have to show this. Virtualbox.org. If you're not familiar with Virtualbox, it's free and open source, but there's this big scary red logo on the bottom of their main page. And if you go to contribute, allowing Oracle to incorporate your contributions, you have to actually sign a special contributors agreement. And I think that involves your first children and your dog. So, you know, I'm not necessarily recommending it. I'm just saying it's a free tool that you can download and use, maybe. So anyways, but the idea is I do a Vagrant init. It creates a Vagrant file. It's a Ruby file, but it looks kind of like, suspiciously like a config file. Essentially, you define all the parameters for your VM, and then you do a Vagrant up, and it copies the template and deploys it. So let's actually go through and do that. Let's see, I got a lot of screens here. So what I have is this tool called Vagrant is installed. When it installs, it puts itself in your path. and you get a whole lot of commands. I am running, just for posterity's sake, Vagrant 184. I believe 185 is out now. It's a little bit newer, just gives some different features. Now, I've already done my init, but it creates this thing called a Vagrant file, okay? And a Vagrant file, if I look at it, is really, and I want to make this big enough so everybody can see it, and you should all be able to memorize this and immediately recreate your own, right? No. Do a Vagrant init. So what you do, before I do this, you just go in, make a new directory, my VM, you go in there and you do Vagrant init. It creates the Vagrant file for you. If I were to do a Vagrant up right now, I would get a virtual machine within just a couple of minutes. It's that quick and simple, right? So we'll do Vagrant up, and we'll see exactly which one it's going to use. It's broken because I'm on a MiFi, and I'm not allowing myself to do that big download right now. But that's the idea. It's going to download that base template for you and start working, all right? It also will, Vagrant calls them boxes. So when I look at the boxes, these are all the boxes that I have downloaded or that I have built. So I actually have used Bento Box. Get it? Bento Box? Those are the publicly available ones that HashiCorp has made available. Then I've done a couple of custom ones, just a couple. Some of them using VMware, some of them using Virtualbox. But again, the idea is that these are template VMs. They're usually pretty small, usually a couple of 100 meg. I think the default CentOS image that they download is only about 300 meg. And once you download it, you've got it, and away you go. So let's look at the Vagrant file really quickly. I specify my box or my template. And in this case, it's a Bento, which is one of the provided ones, and it's CentOS 6.7. I'm living in the past, I understand, but I really hate systemd. So then in here we get to say, because this is Ruby, I get to just write Ruby. So this is just a variable, my VM, I give it a name. And then I define the VM, I define the host name, I can set forwarded ports, I can say if I have any custom network settings, how many CPUs I should have, how much memory I have. Vagrant takes care of all of this for me. So I don't have to restore or copy the VM, go into Virtualbox or go into VMware and start clicking all these settings. This is all done for me, right? It's very, very fast and it just works. And I get the chance to choose what providers. In this case, do I want Virtualbox? Do I want VMware? There's a lot of different options there, okay? We're just going to use the Virtualbox option here. And then we'll get into provisioning in a second. But I'm just going to show you basically, not with the one that was acting up because I'm on crazy networks. Let me just make sure I am on the right. Yeah, I am. So I am going to Vagrant up. Now this is on my CentOS 6.7 box. It's bringing up, you see it's going to import the base box. It's going to import that template for me. And then before we even get there, it's going to fix the MAC address. It's going to check if there's a new version available, sets the host name, sets my forwarded ports, starts booting the machine already, right? That fast. Instead of taking it, the reality is doing the copy, doing everything else, we'd be half an hour before the point where we were ready to boot the VM and just do something with it. Let's just see here. Okay, there it goes. So Vagrant basically gets connected in. It actually SSHs in. Make sure that guest additions or the VMware agent is installed properly and working. And then it actually does some file system mounts for us. So if I move the VM out of the way, you see that this folder, the one I was sitting in, my home directory called CentOS 6.7, it actually mounts that inside the VM. So even the shared disk stuff, just to get files back and forth, is already taken care of me. And now at this point, what I've told Vagrant is, okay, once you're done, I want you to go ahead and fire up Chef. So it's moved on to the next step. So Vagrant has done that first half of a day that I've been sitting here complaining about. It's done for me. And it's done consistently every single time. So if I use this Vagrant file again for another purpose, I will know that at this point, the machine is identical to what it was before. Now, the other cool thing is we talk, one of the big things is updates and installing the right version of software. I've disabled it because I wasn't sure of the state of the Wi-Fi, but you see it's going on here. We'll look at this in a minute. But Vagrant also can run all of your updates for you. So I disabled it because it takes too long and I didn't want it to do it here, but it would take maybe another 5 to 7 minutes or so, and it'll actually applied all of the updates that we have for the system. So where in the old days you would start up your image and then you would have to apply those updates separately and wait for them to go, you can just run one command and wait for it to finish. You don't have to worry about it. And we'll look at the Chef stuff that's happening. You see Chef is running, and actually what's it doing here? It's installing Postgres for me. So I have a Chef cookbook whose whole purpose in life was to go ahead and set up a database and run it through to completion. Right? So it installed Postgres, and it actually did download over the hotspot right from PGDG. It installed the RPMs, it created the user, it did some customization, like moving the data directory, which I really don't like the one that PGDG uses, and away I go. Now, to Bruce's point, the question is, how do we build these Chef cookbooks? How do we get them the way that we want them? It is very iterative. You can see very quickly that I was able to, it took 42 seconds to do the Postgres installation, but let's go look. So 12:55 is when that finished. If we scroll all the way back, yeah, I even deployed a schema there. Look at that trick. Too far. And again, I'm on East Coast time, so that's why it's 12:55. I don't know how far back it went. It only took a couple minutes, right? So exactly how long it took, we'll see in a second again, but it was less than 5 minutes, and I went from absolute zero to having Postgres set up and deployed. So, at this point, systems administrators usually okay, you can have the box, but don't breathe around it because if it breaks, I'm going to be really unhappy. Whereas in my case, I'm going to do a vagrant destroy, if I can type, -F, which is force. Essentially, that shuts down the VM. That's a nuclear option. It just nuked all of the virtual files, the virtual disks, everything for what it had built. Why would I do that? Because I can recreate it from scratch in under 5 minutes. So why do I care about saving it? So Bruce, to your point, when I'm building my Chef manifests and when I'm building, or my Chef cookbooks, and when I'm building these workflows for all these different operating systems, it's iterative, but what I want to do is use Chef to try something out. If I have a problem, I just throw it away and start over. You don't want to get to the point where you have a VM that you're always trying to keep as pristine and taking snapshots because you're going to miss something and you want to skip back to, and there's going to be some weird state in the middle. So you want to go from zero and have it deploy cleanly every time. And as a matter of fact, Chef includes tools that I don't talk about here called the Test Kitchen. And the Test Kitchen plugs into Vagrant so that you can test your cookbooks very quickly and easily. So again, if I wanted to, all I have to do now is a Vagrant up, and it'll redeploy the entire thing for me, right? It's kind of beautiful. So now that we've talked about Vagrant and we've talked about, oh, this is my funny joke. Every time a VirtualBox VM starts somewhere, a baby smiles, right? That's the... all right, so we've been talking about the tools, how do we use Chef and Puppet, or Chef and or Puppet, but I haven't actually showed you what they are yet. So what are they? In Chef, we have recipes. It's kind of like if you've ever used Bucardo for Postgres replication. They sometimes go a little too far with the terminology. So a Chef will have, like Bucardo, the tables for replication children are called kids because that's what child goats are called, kids, right? So Chef takes it to a whole new level. So you've got Chef recipes, that's kind of cute. You have the Test Kitchen, which is the testing framework I just told you about. You have a tool called Knife. You've got the Supermarket, that is a group of a collection of cookbooks and other tools. So it's cute, but it sometimes does go too far, but it is what it is. Puppet uses something called manifests. They're very similar in nature. The idea is I'd say what I want to happen. I don't say how I want it to happen. So I am going to say, I want you to install a package, not run yum install -y blah. It's not iterative, it's declarative, okay? It provides both of these, all these tools, and Ansible is the same way, provide a consistent systems information API. In order for Chef to understand, if I tell it to install a package called HTTPD, Chef needs to know how to talk to the operating system. That's all done for me. It's a systems info API. What OS am I on? Am I on hardware? Am I on a virtual machine? How many CPUs do I have? All those kind of things. And there's consistency across platforms. And these also provide a file management system. We talked about my Etsy password example, right? So the ability to have templates and add new things to existing files and make sure that they're consistent is important. So let's look at Chef. Chef is the one that I personally like. I'll show you why in a second. Well, it's actually bullet point number 3 is order matters. But Chef has full client server mode or solo mode. Essentially, that's what we're using here, which is take this cookbook, parse it, and run it for me. In an enterprise deployment, I would have a Chef server that all my cookbooks would be. See, I almost fell. I told you it would happen. It was that close. So all of my Chef cookbooks would be deployed to a server, and then when my server came up, it could pull those down. What you see on the right there is actually that sysinfo API I was talking about. It's called OHAI, O-H-A-I. You can actually just run the command OHAI on any server that Chef's installed on, and you will get back a really nice JSON file that gives you consistent information. So I can very quickly tell CentOS versus Ubuntu versus Solaris versus Windows. It's consistent. No matter what platform I'm running on, it gives me a consistent view back through this JSON file, okay? The other thing about Chef, and this is, Puppet is trying to change their ways in this area, but just like a shell script, order matters in Chef. If I declare that the HTTP package should be installed before I try to start the HTTP service, it will happen in that order. In Puppet, it does not. In Puppet, you have to explicitly list a dependency chain there, and it gets kind of strange how it's done. So in Chef, the dependency chain is top to bottom in your cookbook or in your recipe. In Puppet manifests, you actually have to chain them together with some funny syntax. That's personally why I like Chef. Now, Puppet is trying to change that. I don't know the specifics of it because I haven't looked at it in a little while. But very similarly, Puppet is also Ruby-based. It's client-server or standalone mode. Your manifest files in Puppet declare the end state. And in this case, they don't use OHAI, which is a Chef cute thing. They use something called factor, which provides your facts about a system. Okay. So if I'm in Chef and I'm doing something and doing OS detection, that API underneath that JSON file, I don't even need to worry about parsing that thing. I could call it if I wanted to, but Chef gives me some really simple language. When a platform for a node is Debian or Ubuntu, do the following. When it's Red Hat, CentOS, Fedora, do this. No more trying to parse Etsy release. No more trying to look at what version the kernel is. None of that. There's quite extensive bits of syntax here for this. And I'm not going to go into all of them, but it makes life a lot easier. Okay? In Puppet, it's a little bit different, but it looks somewhat similar. In the case of an operating system, do X, Y, Z. Now, here's another reason that I personally like Chef a little bit more. I'm a systems administrator, right? I think top down. And I think, what do I want to happen and how do I want it to happen? It's got to be documentable. This is code, right? This is actually just Ruby code, and it looks suspiciously object-oriented. When you look at Chef, it's still code, but it's kind of a little bit cleaner. It's a little bit less object-oriented. My simple sysadmin brain can follow it a little bit better. The one I personally haven't worked with, which is also huge in this space, is Ansible. I don't talk about it here, but Ansible, I don't show it here, I'll talk about it. Ansible uses YAML files as playbooks, and they apparently read even more like documentation than what Chef does. So, it's just about whether you prefer code, whether you prefer documentation, or somewhere in between. So let's go back to our OpenSSL case. I said, okay, 2 people next to each other, go ahead, try and figure it out and do it in under 2 minutes. You can't. You got to spend a lot of time on Google. Or whatever ever search engine you like. But in this case, what I'm going to say is I want to install the package OpenSSL. I tell Chef, install the package OpenSSL. And if it's a Red Hat or CentOS, use OpenSSL devel. If it's Ubuntu or Debian, use libssl dev, right? So I still have an if statement, and I still have to tell it what to do a little bit, or how to do some things a little bit, but really I'm saying, here's the package name I want you to install. I don't need to worry about figuring out what the operating system is underneath, and there's some abstraction here that just gains me some simplicity. I still have to know that it's OpenSSL devel versus libssl dev, but there's not too many ways around that, especially because those communities keep changing it. But here I don't have to write a bunch of code. I'm just declaring on these platforms do this, on these platforms do this, okay? So we'll do a couple of runs here. So you saw the Postgres run. Let's see if I can find my shell. So if we look, I have a couple of other cookbooks here. Let's see here. And by the way, just in case you're wondering, this tool is called MacVim, and this thing on the left is called NerdTree. It's the greatest tool that I've ever used. So if you're looking for a good graphical Vim that will let you copy and paste without copying line numbers and things on the Mac, it's a cool tool. Bruce?
There's none of these package managers that abstract out, I want OpenSSL into platform-specific information that they know.
Not really, no. It's still obnoxious. You still have to dig a little bit, but it's not as much work as it used to be, because now I can just say on these platforms do this. So it's still not a given, but it's not as bad, right? It's less work. So what I have here is a chef recipe, or I'm sorry, a chef cookbook. And in a cookbook, I have a recipe. And that recipe is going to be to deploy an application. In this case, it's going to be an application that we all know and maybe love, or whatever, called PHP pgadmin. So I know if I stand back for a second and somebody says to me, hey, install PHP pgadmin, what am I going to do? I need a web server. I need PHP. I need PHP with the PGSQL connectors. The web server has to be running, and I have to extract pgadmin or PHP pgadmin into that directory, right? So you think of the shell script you would need in order to do that, right? It's going to be more than 13 lines of code. This is the beauty of Chef. I'm able to say, hey, grab the package HTTPD, then the package PHP, and then PHP PGSQL. And then I want you to enable and start the service HTTPD. Now, that line right there is another one. There's a lot buried behind that. Because what if I run this on Ubuntu 12? It has to deal with Upstart, right? If I run this on CentOS 7, it has to deal with systemd. If I run it on 6.7, which I have here, it's using sys5 init scripts. I don't care about any of that. All I'm saying is there's a service called HTTPD. I want you to enable it. And enable means that it's going to run on a reboot. And then I want you to start it right now. Go ahead. And then I'm saying I want you to pull from a directory some PHP pgadmin and basically deploy those files to me. So I'll show you that in a second. But let's go ahead and run this bad boy. So I'm going to tell Vagrant that we already did the DB. Now I want you to use chef app. And Vagrant is going to run, when I run Vagrant provision, it's going to run that chef provisioner for me. There we go. What could go wrong? Ever do a demo in front of a room of people? Here it goes. So it compiles the cookbooks. It's now installing HTTPD for me. And the nice thing about Chef and Puppet, they both will do retries. So if you've got some weird network problems or whatever, they'll pull exactly what you tell them. And in this case, I didn't specify a version. So it's pulling the full version of each thing, and then it deployed it. And now we're on to the fact where we're actually extracting PHP pgadmin into our web server, right? And so the way that the way that Chef is looking at it, it's actually looking at every single file. Remember I said there's this concept of the idempotent nature of something. Basically, Chef is actually looking at every single file in the source, and it's diffing it against the target. And it says, if there's any differences at all, take what's there and apply those deltas. So Chef is actually not just extracting, but it's making sure that the file that I've said on the source is guaranteed to be exactly what I think it is when it gets to the target. So it's not just a straight copy. It's not just a dumb overwrite. It's a very intelligent operation that's enforcing and validating the end state for me. And that's a very, very critical thing, because we don't just want to deploy files and not know that they're correct. We want to make sure that they are what they say they are. Okay? Now, that was very verbose because I was watching the terminal as it ran, and I guess I have 10 minutes. But Chef went through, and you notice even basic things like SE Linux security contexts, which I still don't even know what utility you're supposed to use to manage those things properly. But that's all handled for you. So all of the things that we know are important that we always disable when we're doing a deploy is taken care of by that system. Puppet's very similar, right? So now what I'm going to do is, okay, I've showed you that you can Vagrant up a machine, but how do I actually get to it? Well, you saw, when the baby smiled, I actually have the VM GUI running right here, so I could click in there. Or the really cool thing about Vagrant is I can say, when I'm in the same directory as my Vagrant file, Vagrant SSH. And that's actually going to SSH me direct. I don't even need to know the IP of that VM I created, but it put me right in there. So I have kind of direct access from my own host, and I can interact with it very nicely. And so if we just look very quickly, we have HTTPD running. We have in var www HTML. PHP pgadmin is deployed, and if my port forwarding is correct, which who knows these days, let's see, so I go back and I look, and so what I said here is, in this VM, now the VM is buried on a private network that's shared with my host operating system. I said, I want you to forward from my host port 8000 to port 80 on the VM. So I should be able to, let's see, go over, I've got too many windows, here we go. Go to localhost, I said 8000, and there we go. We see CentOS, and I can go /php pgadmin, right? So now my application was completely deployed by running a single command, right? Now, if I were developing the cookbook, Bruce, to your point, let's say that I realize that there's a problem with one of the PHP files in here, right? How would I deal with that if I'm kind of iteratively developing across it? So let's see. So I'm going to go to, in my cookbook, in Chef app, I have a bunch of files. In those files, I have all my PHP pgadmin files. Let's update index.php and do something really silly, like add a couple of lines of comments. Oh, hello, and then a blank line just for fun. Now if I head back up to my top directory and I rerun Chef again, now I could at this point do a Vagrant destroy and a Vagrant up, but all I really have to do is get Chef to run again. I could log in and run it manually, or I could just tell Vagrant to do it for me. Vagrant's going to go ahead and run and look at whether it's the input files that I want or whether it was the actual recipe itself. Now it's going to look at the differences and apply them for me. So we see it compiled the cookbook. You see it validated it did all these things, files, up to date, up to date, up to date. And we saw one way back here. That was our index.php. I could scroll forever. But you see that it found one and it did the difference for us, okay? So, well, there's a couple there that probably changed because when I started it up. So they've been updated. But the idea is that it's actually validating the inputs. It's seeing what changed, and it's pushing those differences, right? So it's very incremental. Again, the idea is no matter what the input, I'm enforcing this output. Tell it what I want, and it does it for me. So iterative development is very simple, right? So if I were doing something a little bit more complex, like my DB cookbook here, and I got 7 minutes left, so I'm going to rush a little bit. But my DB cookbook, my recipe, my default, let's take a look at installing PG. This one's a little more complicated because I do have some code here that's doing a couple of things to actually download from PGDG. But as I'm developing and adding, hey, create this directory pglog, create this directory pgxlog, if I were having problems with that, I could just fix it and then rerun it again. And because of the fact that it's going to be idempotent and it's going to be getting me to that state, if it gets to that state, I'm happy with it. So I have tried manually doing it, but what I found is if you're going to manually do it, it's better to do it in Chef because then it's self-documenting, and then it really is write once, run everywhere, versus when you do it manually and then you convert it to a shell script and then hope. Right? So the best workflow that I found, if you're using Chef, Puppet, Ansible, is when you start, do it as a Chef recipe. Use Vagrant and leverage that and write these things iteratively, and then when you're done, it's going to work everywhere. Right? And if it doesn't for some reason, then test it on that platform and you can iterate and fix it there. It's a lot easier than trying to remember what you did and apply that as a script or even as a recipe later on. Now, this all sounds awesome, right? So we did PHP, pgadmin, but there's a problem, right? What's the problem? The problem is databases, they're not files. They are files, but they're lots of crazy files that change a lot. They're not disposable, right? Everything that I've done here, if I need a new PHP pgadmin server, great, I can spin one up in 2.5 minutes, beautiful. But if I were to Vagrant destroy a 4 terabyte database that I've built up over 6 years, I'm not gonna be able to recreate that in 2.5 minutes with a Vagrant file. And you have to be very careful, right? Also, if you're using, there's a big public Chef cookbook for Postgres. It's done by a group called Opscode. They've actually abstracted the entire PostgreSQL.conf into Ruby. So you don't even put a file in there. You just say, hey, this is what I want Postgres' max connections to be. That's great, but if I do a git push and then the Chef server picks that up and the Chef client runs it, the Opscode cookbook is extremely intelligent. It knows that in order for max connections to be changed, the DB has to be restarted. So it will happily restart your database for you half an hour after you do a git push. That's not something that I personally like. The other trick, you could say, okay, well, I'm going to shut down the Chef clients on the database servers. Sounds like a good idea. Until your sysadmin wants to add a user, and there's been 3,000 other changes have happened since the last time you ran it, then you get into a state where you can't run anything. So what am I saying? Be careful. Don't overuse Chef. Don't use it for everything. Pick and choose what you're going to use it for. Deploy Postgres. Get a standard directory structure. Follow corporate standards. Enforce what you need to enforce. But when it comes to some things, like the Postgres.conf, that is sacrosanct. That thing is very carefully crafted over lots of iterative testing and development, and I want to make sure that when a change goes, it's done very tightly controlled, right? So you think of, if I am Mr. DevOps, right, I could very quickly blow away my database. What about schema management? Now I'm getting close on time here, but this is just another thing to be careful of. Is schema management, how easy is it or hard is it to deploy the idempotent nature of things to schema manage it? Seems like it should be easy. But if we look, let's do a quick example. So you guys saw me deploy Postgres once already, and using the Chef DB cookbook, we pushed it out. That's great. But you know what I just realized? I realized that my invoicing database, the SQL file, I was kind of reviewing it the other day, and somebody, for testing, disabled the primary key on my invoices table in my schema. I went, oh, well, using the Chef pattern, I should be able to save this, and I should just be able to run Vagrant provision, or run the Chef client, right?
You can also call HR to have you deal with that person.
It could very well do that. But in this case, because what's the side effect of that, right? So let's go take a look. It depends on how our cookbooks are built, but if I SSH in there now, Vagrant SSH, I'm going to assume the identity of the Postgres user, and I'm going to go into my invoicing database. Now the table was on invoices, so I'm going to say, okay, select the invoice ID and account from invoices, group by INV ID, order by INV ID. Now, I just added primary key enforcement to that column, but because I just ran the whole SQL file, Chef very happily applied it for me. It recopied all the data and then it tried to enable the primary key constraint, and it couldn't. But I just completely corrupted my database logically because I let Chef do it for me blindly. Chef doesn't, the idempotent nature of files is great for files, but not for databases, right? So when you're looking at schemas, you still need to use tools that manage schemas. You don't want to let Chef try and do that for you, or Puppet or Ansible. Use a tool like Skitch, Liquibase, APG-Diff, Flyway, Bob's Backyard Schema Management System, whatever you happen to have, because they are designed for managing differences between Postgres. Now, even those tools, right, are these two things the same? Right? My public.invoices table, I've got an INV ID, customer ID, invoice name, invoice date. But you know what? That's what the top version is what my gold master schema says. My bottom version was what I was able to do in production. I needed to add a column later on. Those are logically the same table. But most of these tools are going to see those as two completely different relations. As a matter of fact, at a customer of mine, we had this exact scenario with this exact table name, and the automation decided the only way to resolve the difference was drop table invoices and then create a new empty one for us, right? So you have to be very careful. So even if you are using tools like APG-Diff, Skitch, or Liquibase, you have to apply them and use them with a grain of salt, all right? And in this case, you see that the only thing what it wanted to do was completely drop those constraints and rerun them. APG-Diff is a little bit older. I don't necessarily recommend it. But at some point, you have to stop using automation, and usually that's where your data is concerned. So as a DBA, you still protect that thing, and you automate to a point. You automate what you can and what you should and what's really obnoxious. But when it comes to the data and the database itself, pay close attention, okay? At the end of the day, we still have developers and we still have operations, and some people are both, but they're always focused on one or the other. Automate what you can. Focus on the business, focus on what you can do right, and remember, everything in moderation, right? Don't automate everything. It's gonna bite you in the rear end. That's what I've got. Thank you, everybody. Well, any questions? Any more questions? Okay, thank you.